want to take some of the elements that Mr. Khan talked about and then add a few more and apply them to the more current, immediate concerns that we have, especially the COVID-19 pandemic, and how that relates to this debate of devolution and federalism and so forth. So to start with first principles, I'd say one of the things that distinguishes Pakistan and its this federalism debate as well from a lot of other countries is something that Mr. Khan mentioned, which is basically the importance of the civil-military balance and the civil-military relationship. We have to appreciate that with devolution, or both with devolution or decentralization, the ability of the civil and military relations to be predictable, becomes much more complicated. Because when you devolve and when you decentralize, then it's not enough for example, one federal head to be talking to one, let's say, military head. Rather, you have a lot of different centers of power which may not see eye to eye. So there's not going to be a lot of coordination, and that can lead to trouble or difficulties in civil-military relations. Now, you will appreciate that this is especially important in Pakistan, given our unique history of the role of the military and military-civil society in the past. So that's the first point to keep in mind, which I think is different from India and Nepal and several other countries. A second point to keep in mind is the separation of powers, right? And I mean the horizontal separation of powers. Let's say, for example, at the federal level. It's not the case in Pakistan, as it is in many other countries, that the federal government is united and stands behind whoever the elected representatives happen to be. So you can have the elected representatives, and then you can have the military not seeing entirely eye to eye with them. And you can have the civil service or the bureaucracy not seeing entirely eye to eye with them, and the judiciary not seeing eye to eye with them. So there is already, at the federal level, there isn't this ability to act in a unitary way as you might have, especially when it comes to the bureaucracy, as you might have in many other countries. So if you take the example of many presidential systems like the US and so forth, the bureaucracy in general, which you would normally consider to be part of the executive branch, would fall in line with whatever, let's say, the president is saying. But in the case of Pakistan, that's not, the civil service would not necessarily be in line with what the prime minister is saying. The prime minister and his cabinet would be considered to be the executive authority, right? So the point of making both of these points so far is to say that the federal government, even without devolution, the elected federal government in Pakistan in some ways is already weaker than elected federal governments in many other countries, which don't have these two special problems or these two special concerns, right? So that complicates the issue of how well devolution will work and what kinds of results we can expect from devolution. A third problem, well, a third thing to consider, I shouldn't call it a problem, is just competency and skill building. Now, it's a common phenomenon that where there is a federalist structure, the federal government has more resources, gets better people in their employ in terms of the civil service, the federal civil service and so forth, compared to the state level or the provincial level and so on and so forth, right? The same is true in Pakistan. In Pakistan, not only because of the way that finances work, they flow from the federal government to provinces in a way that's not entirely transparent and isn't always in line with what provinces require, but also in terms of the experience, the institutional memory and the competence to deal with situations with any kind of emergency and situations such as COVID-19 that doesn't exist at the provincial level just because there isn't that much experience. So that's a third factor. That's something that you could learn over time if the provincial structure was strengthened. Then over maybe decades, you would get a system where provincial government would be strong enough to come up with ideas that are consistently competitive with or better than what the federal government is working with. And again, donor support and most of the international support also tends to focus on the federal level historically, even though that's begun to change. So that kind of institutional capacity building also happens at that level. So there are several things to consider in determining what devolution will get us, what the 18th Amendment will get us. A fourth point, very briefly, I want to mention. So I talked about the civil, just in terms of basic civil-military relations, horizontal separation of powers, and people at the federal level not seeing eye to eye, and then competency. Fourth thing I would mention is this local governments. This is something, again, that Mr. Khan mentioned, very important. And bear in mind, when this infrastructure happened, it happened, much of it was strengthened or devised not necessarily during democratic times, like the strengthening of local governments in Pakistan. So a lot of it was actually done during General Musharraf's time, when he was the chief executive of the country. And one interesting dynamic with devolution, as Mr. Khan pointed out, there's the federal level, even constitutionally, the provincial level, and then the local level, is that the local level, local government in many ways can actually strengthen the center or strengthen the federal government rather than weaken it. That's because when you empower local government, there are two things can happen. Either that power is coming from the federal government, or it's coming from the provincial government, right? So in many cases, you actually, when you strengthen local government, you can actually weaken the most credible local representation that you have, which in the case of Pakistan may well be provincial level governments, by taking away some of that legitimacy and power and giving it to these local governments that you can control more easily. So the federal government or the center can have opportunities to more easily control local governments in major cities, let's say like Karachi or Lahore and so forth, than they could with provincial governments such as Sindh. So the black letter law of devolution, and I think this again is something that Mr. Khan talked about, can give the impression that you're actually becoming more representative, when in fact the opposite may be true. That's the first descriptive point. Second point, it might not be a bad thing for the opposite to be true, for devolution to be slower, particularly in times of emergency. And with that, I want to come specifically to this issue of emergencies in general and COVID-19, right? Just as an example of this devolution debate. So Mr. Khan gave excellent examples of how provinces responded in terms of leading the way with quarantining and trying to test at airports and so forth. In Pakistan, there was, and many of you will be aware of this, there was some controversy and discussion over not locking down the country as a whole and introducing these smart lockdown, quote unquote, protocols in our major cities. So the federal government declined to shut down the economy. They thought that the economic cost would be catastrophic, it would be too high. And so they had these, to their credit, they did try to identify based on data and empirical analyses where there was an outbreak, and then they would shut down those regions for some time and then try to manage the crisis this way. This was against the WHO's directives, and at least at one point the WHO had clearly said, and this made the news all over Pakistan, that look, you guys need to shut down, you're not shutting down, this could be catastrophic. There were many projections made about how catastrophic it would be, and the government declined to do so. Now that was an extremely risky strategy for obvious reasons. If it had gone horribly wrong for the government, you might have had you might have had serious repercussions. But for reasons that aren't entirely clear, it seemed to not go as badly as it has in many much more developed countries, in many countries that have much greater healthcare resources and so forth. So that gave an opportunity, and Mr. Khan will correct me if I'm wrong, but it gave an opportunity for the federal government to actually look better than a lot of provincial governments. Particularly Sindh had tried to have a more strict lockdown, which was more in line with what the WHO was saying than the federal government did. But then the consequence was in Sindh, obviously, the economic fallout from that was greater than in the rest of the country where you didn't have such a strict lockdown. And you also didn't have as much of a reduction in the rate of infection and in the fatalities and so forth. So they ended up moving to the federal government plan of a strict lockdown again. So that made the government look better. So, so I think it would be right to say that primarily the response in Pakistan to COVID-19 has been a federal response. And now the federal government could have done this in two ways, and I think they used an intelligent way to do this. And this, again, as Mr. Khan mentioned, they could have declared an emergency. So Articles 292 to 296 or 297, basically, these describe situations where the president can declare an emergency. There's financial emergencies in terms of war, and if the constitutional machinery breaks down. I think it's fair to say that in Pakistan, the constitutional machinery had broken down when the legislatures were closed, when the courts were closed, you weren't having trials anymore. So if anything qualified as an emergency, those emergency powers probably should have been used. But what the federal government did, which I think might have been a good idea politically, but also for practical reasons, was they didn't use explicitly the emergency powers of the Constitution. What they used was the 2010 National Disaster Management Act, which again, interestingly, that gives a lot of power again to the federal government and to the center when there is a disaster. So there's this etymological hocus pocus between what is a disaster and what is an emergency. And so then they empowered the National Disaster Management Authority to make decisions. And the NDMA, as it's called, has authority to make guidelines for both the provincial level and the federal level, and then those have to be followed. And so instead of going the route of emergency powers under the Constitution, they went with this National Coordination Council, the NCC, and the National Coordination Operations Command, as Mr. Khan explained. Both of these bodies, these are federal level bodies. One, and two, both bodies have mixed representation essentially mixed representation from the civilian domain, federal level, and the military domain. So the focus has been really on this civil military union, which I think would have been vastly complicated and would have become much more difficult if we had been more devolved, as has been the case in the US. If folks have followed the news, there have been many states that have taken many different paths in terms of whether or not to control or prohibit or lessen certain kinds of activity that would cause a spread. And it became a political issue. And that's why you're seeing a country with much greater medical resources and much greater education level, economic resources and so forth, in part because of that, because of this politicization, which is, let's face it, that kind of politicization is encouraged the more politics there is. The more, if there's hotly contested local government elections, hotly contested provincial elections, you're going to have things get politicized. And you can't afford to do that, I think, you can't afford to put things bluntly, play politics or have political experiments at a time of national emergency when people are dying by the tens of thousands or by the hundreds of thousands around the world. So I guess to summarize what I've been saying, I think devolution, there is a role for devolution in becoming more representative and in lessening federal power in general. And I do agree that in Pakistan, government is not representative as it should be in classic democratic theory. But it is weak. It can't get away with doing whatever it wants to, because internally it's very divided, and if it's not balanced by voters, it is balanced in some other ways, even though I recognize that there are problems with that. But that debate we can continue. And I'm not going to say it's a good system. I do think devolution is important. I just think it's a much more long-term project. What I do want to say is that during an emergency time or a disaster time such as COVID, you should have unified action. I think that's why those emergency provisions are there in our constitution and are there in every constitution pretty much, because you need that unitary power. You go back to Roman times in Cincinnatus and so forth. You need that unitary, almost dictatorial executive power where the entire nation can act as one. and you can have a time bar on it, but you don't want to be doing that at a time such as this COVID-19 crisis that we're going through right now.